ready to start? Okay. I'm Marilyn Ruschemeyer, and as a research professor at the Watson Institute, I chair the Institute's lecture series on European politics. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Timothy Snyder, again to Brown University, where he earned his bachelor's degree with concentrations in European history and political science. He received his doctorate from Oxford University in 1997. Timothy Snyder is the Hutham Professor of History at Yale. Working mostly on Eastern Europe, he has quickly become one of the leading American historians and public intellectuals. His book, titled Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, has transformed our understanding of the European mass murders of the 20th century. It received the Literature Award of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Hannah Arendt Prize, and the Leipzig Book Prize for European Understanding. Today's lecture on Ukraine and Russia in a fracturing Europe will give us his analysis of the developments since the uprising in Kiev, the topic of his last lecture here at the Watson, if we remember correctly. Okay. Professor Snyder, welcome.
Thanks. Thank you very much. So the premise, the title is Ukraine and Russia in a fracturing Europe. And the way that I would like to think about the title, the way that I'd like to think about the topic is not just to ask about a status quo and what it looks like when it falls apart, but to inquire instead about the fracturing agent. So is there in fact something which is making things fall apart, right? Is it just that the center is not holding, or are there forces at work which help the center not to hold, right? Are there reasons why that falcon is getting lost in that widening jeer and can't hear the falconer? So my premise is going to be to take the question as a question about agency or a question about causality. I'm not just going to set Russia and Europe in place against this Europe which is falling apart, but I'm going to ask if the predicament of Russia, the predicament of Ukraine, the predicament of Europe have something in common, and whether that something might be a kind of explanation. So one way to pose the question, or one way maybe to clarify the question in terms of political theory, would be to talk about the state. So if you look at the title, if we think about the title again, Russia, Ukraine, fracturing Europe, none of these entities, and I'm just saying this as a way to kind of warm up for the explanation, none of these entities is a state in an unproblematic way, which is one of the reasons why I think attempts to explain the last 5 years, which is going to be what I try to do, in terms of conventional political science or national relations theory, tend to founder. Now, why am I saying these places are not states in a conventional way? Well, what I want to claim, I'm going to try to defend this, what I want to claim is that statehood is actually a question here rather than an axiom. So normally when we wander into an international relations problem, we assume that statehood is the thing that is fixed and other things might be in motion, like maybe leadership changed or the environment changed, or maybe there are some new interests, maybe there's a new institution. But we tend to assume that the state is somehow fixed. But what if the state is the thing that's in motion, right? Both practically and theoretically. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, let's start with Russia, right? Now, Russia's image of itself is that it is the stable state in the region, right? Other places come and go, other states are artificial, they're fractured, they're historically illegitimate, they're decadent, whatever it might be, there are all kinds of adjectives. Other places all have qualifications. Russia has no qualification, right? Russia simply exists, it's been there forever, it will be there forever. Now, what I would want to suggest is that, in fact, this very language of security and stability and continuity, right, this very attempt to put the existence of Russia outside of any possible brackets, reflects a very real insecurity. Russia actually lacks one of the fundamental elements of a normal state. And I don't mean like a terrific democratic rule of law state. I mean a state. And that basic thing which it lacks is a succession principle. Okay, so I'm talking about something very, very, very basic, right? A problem in political life since as long as political life has been recorded. In 2011, the people who currently run Russia chose not to have a succession principle, right? So that's one way, it's one way of characterizing faking elections demonstrably, and making it clear that what you're going to do indefinitely is have fake elections and do it in a demonstrative way, right? What that does, it's not just that that's not democracy, right? It's not just that that is managed democracy or sovereign democracy or whatever Sorokov wants to call it. It is the absence of a succession principle, right? And everyone, of course, in Russia understands this, but it's not something you can articulate. Right? The question of what happens after Putin is not one that you sort of whistle happily down the street as you're walking down central Moscow, but it is in the back of everyone's mind, I think it's fair to say. Right? So you're now in a situation where there's no clear succession principle, and that's Russia's basic problem as a state. And I want to suggest that that's a source of a lot of energy, right? That's a source of a kind of ideological opportunity, and I'm going to try to characterize how ideology comes in and fills that gap. Okay. Ukraine in 2013, right? Russia in 2011 fakes elections, denies itself a succession principle. And then it begins to tell a story in 2012, and especially in 2013, about something called Eurasia, where Eurasia is going to be a substitute, a replacement, an alternative to the European Union. Eurasia is an economic organization. It's meant to include Kazakhstan, Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, some other places, but it's also an idea. And the idea, as far as one can make out, is that the European Union, rather than being progressive, is fundamentally decadent, right? That Russia, rather than being decadent, is fundamentally sound, and that the destiny, the direction of European history is not where we think it's actually towards Russia. Now, this idea is consistent with the suppression of democracy in 2011, because when you suppress democracy in 2011, what do you say? You say, these protesters were supported from the outside. You say, these people are middle-class people who have been contaminated by their contact with Europe. This is not an authentic movement from within. This is fundamentally something caused by NGOs, civil society, European money, and Hillary Clinton personally. She also comes into the mix. She gave the signal, to quote Putin's famous words at the time, to bring about these protests, right? So when you're suppressing elections and you're denying yourself your own succession principle, you are simultaneously saying, this is not our problem. This is something which came from the outside. So in Ukraine in 2013, the events in Ukraine in 2013 have to be seen in the context of a kind of political crisis which is already underway in Russia. Because what happens in Ukraine in 2013 is almost too much like what happens in Russia in 2011, right? What happens in Ukraine in 2013 is that when the Ukrainian government switches its own policy, under Russian pressure and after the offer of an awful lot of Russian money, when the Ukrainian government switches its own policy from, yes, we want an association agreement with the European Union, to no, we no longer want an association agreement, then people protest. And they protest in the name of what? Europe, right? And who are they? They're the middle classes, right? It's exactly the kind of scenario which the Russian leaders almost pretended happened in 2011 in their own country. It actually does happen in 2013 in Ukraine. And when it's happened, the Russian narrative about it, right, by which I mean both the media and the leaders, is that this is not authentic, this comes from the outside, right? This is Hillary Clinton. This is the Obama administration, this is Victoria Nuland, this is NGOs, this is international civil society. Whatever it can be, it's not Ukraine, right? And along the way, it's suggested very strongly from President Putin on down that Ukraine isn't really a society. I mean, Ukrainians logically cannot be protesting because there isn't such a thing as Ukrainians. Ukraine and Russia are one people, right, says the president of the Russian Federation, which is a pretty extraordinary thing to say, right? I mean, Russianist colleagues sometimes, minimize this because they kind of think it themselves. But if I were to stand up and say that Russia and Canada, that America and Canada are one people, right, that would be strange. And it is actually a strange thing for a head of state to say. But Putin is saying this in late 2013. And it's part of the rationale for why what's happening in Ukraine must come from abroad, because it can't logically be coming from inside Ukraine because there is no Ukrainian nation, there's no Ukrainian society. Which brings us to the third actor, right? Fracturing Europe, Europe. Europe's not a state, right? That's not a, everyone knows that. Europe is not a state. It's a collection of states, and it's a collection of states which exerts a kind of influence or kind of attraction on both Russia and Ukraine, to various extents at various times to various peoples. But what it's not is not a state. So what this all suggests is that if we want to try to get our minds around these events, or if there is any legitimate theoretical way to address these events, it can't start by assuming the existence of the state. It has to start somewhere else. And to take a step further, and here is where I'm going to go a place which I hope is new for you and innovative. If we're going to find an idea which could be behind this, right? If we're going to find the agent of disillusion, the force that's doing the fracturing, the thing which is breaking the status quo, it's going to have to be some kind of idea which is comfortable, right, with the lack of a state. And the proposal that I'm going to make, is that the idea which is behind all of this, or which in some way has some causal force, is fascism. Okay, I hope if you've fallen asleep already, now that's the point where you're supposed to wake up, is when I say fascism, right? You're all cued to wake up when people say fascism. Okay, so now why would this be a reasonable way to proceed? I've already suggested one reason, which is the absence of the state, or the fluidity of the state, or the character of the state as a question rather than the answer, right? Fascism is comfortable with that. Fascism is comfortable with orders being done and undone, with states rising and falling, right? Most of the ways we look at the world are not comfortable with states rising and falling. Fascism is. Another reason why, and this might be a reasonable way to try to explain Russian behavior in the last 5 years, is that other ways of trying to do so don't work. Right? So if you try to explain, I mean, you can do this empirically. You can ask what political scientists predicted any of this stuff, right? But you can ask, one by one, how is what Russia done in the last 5 years realistic, right? So if you're a realist, you would say Russia is should balance between Europe and China, and instead what it's done is it's tried to undo the European side, making itself much more vulnerable to China, right? Not very sound as classical realism. Or if you care about institutions, you believe that laws are real, why has Russia, in invading Ukraine and annexing Crimea, challenged, perhaps even undone, the fundamental norm of international law, right, of territorial sovereignty? Why would you do that when you have the longest land border in the world, right? It's an odd thing to do. Or let's say you're an international relations person, you think economics matter, right? Well, then why did Russia imperil its trade relations with what is and what must be its major trade partner, the European Union? It's hard to explain Russian behavior along any of these classical lines. Something else, I think, has to be going on. Now, when I say fascism, I mean immediately, like the dogs start to salivate, right? Like what do I mean when I'm enunciating this word? Why am I bringing this word up? Usually, when we talk about fascism, we're in the midst of making some kind of historical analogy. We are asking, is Trump like Hitler, right? It's more like Mussolini is the answer, but is Trump like Hitler, right? Like when we say fascism in the West, what we're usually doing is throwing ourselves back towards a historical analogy. If we say fascist in Russian or Ukrainian, we're usually like calling somebody a bad name, right? And both of those acts are sort of empty. What I want to try to do is suggest something else. What I want to try to do is, oh, by the way, Trump is going to come back into this story by the end in a different way, right? In a non-name calling way. Well, maybe I can't quite promise that, but Trump is going to come back into this story, and I hope in an interesting way before it's all over. Okay, what do I mean? What I mean is that there is, in fact, a fascist geopolitical thinker who has been revived in Russia in the 21st century. Now, here, we come across, first of all, something very interesting, because I'd ask you to think, how many major forgotten 20th century political theorists have been revived in the 21st century, right? Can you think of one? And if you can, you're helping me, because in my opinion, there aren't any. And I don't mean someone like Carl Schmitt, who admittedly is very, very popular now, but Carl Schmitt was never forgotten, right? Can you think of someone who was a major thinker who was totally forgotten and then has been revived and has become important. Okay, what do I mean by important? Now here we hit the classic problem of influence, right? Influence, how can you know that ideas influence people? Which I'm not going to solve in this talk. I am just going to toss at you a few bits of evidence which I hope are intuitively convincing. One sign that a thinker might be influential upon a political class is that when there is a reading group, for example, in the Kremlin, and they read his books, right? That's one sign. These are all things that happen, by the way. Another sign that a thinker might be influential is when all of his works are republished in huge editions over a short period of time. That happens. Another sign that a thinker might be influential is when you go and you exhume his body from a faraway country, bring it back to your country, bury it with full military honors, and have the Patriarch of Moscow give a long speech about it. Another sign that a thinker might be influential is when you go to America, buy the archive, physically bring it back to Moscow, right? Another sign that a thinker might be influential is when the head of state regularly lays flowers on the new grave. Another sign that the thinker might be influential is when the head of state cites the thinker every time he does something truly extraordinary, right? So I cannot solve this influence question, right? I can't go from beyond correlation to causality, but these are correlates which I take to be highly suggestive. Who is the thinker that I'm talking about? The head of state is obviously Vladimir Putin. Who is the thinker that I'm talking about? The thinker that I'm talking about is a man called Iván Ilyín. Iván Ilyín, right? Does that mean anything? Yeah, okay, right? Does that mean anything? Well, it's okay. So Iván Ilyín was an extraordinarily, actually, interesting thinker. And I want in this part of the talk, we've now reached kind of the middle. What I want to do in this part of the talk is to try to give his ideas a certain shape. Because what I don't want to do, I don't want to make the move of just saying he was a fascist. Okay. I mean, because you can show that he was a fascist, but that in a way doesn't answer our question, right? It doesn't answer our question of why he's significant, why he's read now, why he may make a difference. You know, it doesn't answer the question even what is fascism, right? So an easy 500-word essay would be to prove that he was a fascist, which could be done and has actually been done. But what I want to try to do instead is give you just at least a preliminary sense of what his ideas were and how they held together. So he was born in 1883. He dies in 1954. He's a kind of classic figure of the late Russian Silver Age. He comes of age, studies. He's in Moscow. He's from a noble family. He studies in Moscow. He studies with the liberals, right, with Trubetskoy. He himself, like so many people, is left-leaning, even revolutionary in his youth, which of course later he does not want anyone to know about. He does radical things like defend freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. He doesn't throw any bombs, as far as I know, but he does hide bombs for people who do throw bombs. So he has this youthful leftist experience. But what we're concerned about is his right-wing philosophy, and his right-wing philosophy has a couple of really interesting parts. The first is that he is a right-wing Hegelian, right? So he's a right-wing Hegelian. So most of the Hegelians that we think about usually are left-wing Hegelians, right? Or the Marx, right? So what the left-wing Hegelians do with Hegel is they make Hegel about the future and they legitimize revolution, as opposed to being chiefly about the past, as Hegel thought, and leading towards a state. Marx then takes left-wing Hegelianism and says it's not about ideas, but it's about the modes of production. Ilyín is a right-wing Hegelian. He accepts that there's a dialectic. He accepts that there's a spirit, which is quite clear is God, which should be working itself out in history. But here he makes an interesting move. He says, not that God is dead, but God is feeble. God is actually unable to work his way out completely in history, and therefore the struggle between good and evil, between spirit and evil, has to be carried out by the hands of men, right? And then in particular, he says, and this is where things get kind of interesting for contemporary politics, he says, one of the signs of God's weakness is the existence of the middle class. So where many liberals and even many Hegelians would see the middle class as something progressive, he says the middle class is the existence of the middle class, which for him is without morals, without political courage, totally worthless, right? He's one of many political thinkers of the time and place who just hate the bourgeoisie while belonging to it. He thinks that the middle class is evidence of God's weakness. So it follows from this that in practice, in the great struggle between good and evil, people have to make choices. They have to decide what's evil. Okay, which leads to the second thing, which is interesting about his philosophy. I can't make it as interesting as it actually is, which is that he was also a kind of Chekist of God. That's a phrase I'm stealing from his enemies in the 1920s. He was a kind of right-wing Leninist. So where Lenin says about Marx, we can't allow the forces, the changes in means of production just to work themselves out. We have to kind of leap ahead, and it's going to be the party and the intellectuals who say when we're ready. What Ilyín says is that you can't really trust the peasants to know when an important revolutionary, counter-revolutionary moment has arrived. It's the intellectuals who know, what God actually wants. And he goes into great detail about how you figure out what God wants. I mean, extraordinary detail. It makes like our American contemporaries seem really shallow on this point of listening to God. Ilyín studied with Husserl, if that means anything to anyone. Husserl was an extremely important influence on him, but his understanding of Husserl was he used the phenomenological reduction to hear God. Right? So he writes hundreds and hundreds of pages about the experience of hearing God. But for our purposes, the important thing is that it puts the intellectual and Ilyín personally in a position of privilege where he decides. I mean, he actually does decide what is good and what is evil and when we have to act. And in making these arguments, I mean, I can't resist saying this. He goes to extraordinary lengths. Like he gets into texts which you would think one would not engage with, like for example the Gospels. Okay, so he gets into the Gospels and actually debates the idea of loving thy enemy, right? And with tactics which might seem either legalistic or casuistic, depending upon your preference, he makes the argument at great length that Jesus did not actually, when Jesus said love your enemies, he didn't mean love all your enemies. He meant love your personal enemies, but not the enemies of God. Right? And who decides who the enemies of God are? Well, Ilyín himself decides who the enemies of God are. And who are the enemies of God? The Bolsheviks. Okay? So in Ilín's account, which is not so different from many white thinkers, from many people who resisted the revolution in the early 1920s, Bolshevism is not a fundamentally political movement. It's fundamentally metaphysical. It's fundamentally the release of Satan upon the earth. Right? Satan walks the earth in the form of Bolshevism. This is not metaphorical. He means this quite literally. Evil is here, and only men can resist evil. How can men resist evil? Men can resist evil by carrying out fascist coup d'etat. Okay? So then the next step in the thought is to endorse Mussolini and his coup d'etat in Italy as being chivalrous, as being necessary, right? As being correct, as being the only thing that could be done. If one does not support the chivalrous, he gets this chivalry thing directly from Mussolini. If you do not support the chivalrous struggle against the devil, I quote Ilyín, you are yourself the devil, right? So very strong, Old Testament style ways of seeing this struggle. So fascism, says Ilyín, and I like this very much. He says that fascism is the redemptive act of patriotic arbitrariness, which is actually not a bad definition of what fascism is, right? It's arbitrary, it's patriotic, and in the end it's meant to be redemptive. Okay, so Ilyín, when he's making these arguments, is in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. He has a long stay in Italy, but for the most part he's living in Germany in the 20s and 30s. You will not be surprised to learn that when Hitler comes to power in 1933, Ilyín also defends Hitler. He says Hitler is misunderstood. He says the Western press, and especially the Jewish press, is too hard on Hitler. Even the Russian immigrant press, he says, is too hard on Hitler. One has to understand that fundamentally the stakes are good and evil, Bolshevism and anti-Bolshevism. Hitler, he says, has granted European culture a stay of execution. So long as Hitler and Mussolini are in power, European civilization has a chance of surviving. Like many fascists, he equates Jews and Bolsheviks and Jews, and therefore approves of Hitler's discrimination against Jews, right down to approving the definition of a Jew by way of blood. Okay, now that is just by way, all of that is just by way of establishing Ilyín as a kind of fascist, right? I mean, there were many, many fascists in the 1920s and 1930s. These views are not particularly exceptional in the 1920s and 1930s. I just want to have them in the background so they can be clear. Because what's most important for us is the way that Ilyín then later, in Swiss exile after the war, writes a short summary of all of his views. But in the late 40s and early 50s, he writes a short book called Our Tasks, which is a collection of political pamphlets. And it is this book which is first re-released in Russia in the early 1990s and has an immense career. And it's this book which we know that Vladimir Putin has read, along with a number of other people. And what Ilyín does in post-war Switzerland is that he sets out a kind of theory of fascist domestic and foreign policy. Now, he's in Switzerland, I can't resist saying, being supported by an American millionaire. That's like one, like there's a whole list, like when you canonize a thinker, like there are automatically a whole lot of things that you forget. Like one of the things you forget about Ilyín, if you're like the Russian elite now, is that he was in psychotherapy with Freud personally, daily, and that's how he missed the First World War. So rather, he couldn't be mobilized because he and his young wife went to Vienna to have daily psychotherapy with Freud, which is sort of extraordinary, like for a whole list of reasons. And one of them is that he was a graduate student at the time, right? And like as someone who has graduate students, I just can't help but think of the wonderful luxury of being able to say, you know, I think what you should do this spring is go to Freud and have psychotherapy with him personally for the entire spring. Why don't you just do that? Anyway, but the second thing would be that Ilyín was supported by the money of an American millionaire while he was in exile. That would be the second thing, which no one is going to say on a Russian talk show. So Ilyín, writing in Switzerland, takes a step back, crystallizes his views, writes these short articles, and makes the following case for fascism. Now remember, this is after the Second World War, right? After the Second World War, when not for everybody, but for many people, fascism had been discredited, if not by its evil, then by its defeat. This is after the Second World War. The case he makes has four parts. The first, it begins with innocence. Ilyín steps back and he says, Russia as a nation is fundamentally innocent. These are the parts that as a historian are really the hardest to read, because the way he describes Russian history is so unbelievably and I think deliberately naive. But of course he does issue a kind of methodological proviso. What he says is that Russia, the history, he says, is objective, quote, and pure, quote, regardless of what the actual contingent facts might be. So there might be facts which interfere with his telling of Russian history, but that's not important. The way that Russian history is fundamentally innocent. Russia has a virgin birth. So, you know, the Russianists in the crowd will be aware of the so-called Norman controversy, like were there Scandinavians or were there not Scandinavians? The answer is there were lots of Scandinavians for a very long time. But Ilyín is committed to the idea of a virgin birth of Russia. So the Slavs brought into being Russia all by themselves. He's also committed to the idea of an immaculate empire, that the city of Moscow became the largest state in the history of the world territorially while fighting only defensive wars. And he goes through every single battle that Russia ever fought. No, literally, over 1,000 battles, and characterizes every single one of them as defensive, right? And so Russia goes from being a village, actually just a bit of forest, to being this empire, while facing what he calls, quote unquote, 1,000 years of suffering, while facing, quote unquote, endless continental blockade from Europe. The second idea, and you won't be surprised, the second idea is that the nation is organic. So, which he says over and over and over again. I won't belabor it. This is not a category which I'm imposing on the documents. This is a word which screams out of his writings. Russia is organic. You can't, he says, take it apart. You can only dissect it, right? Russian culture is organic, fraternal, which means that anyone who lives on Russian territory, even if they're not Russian, which is a possibility he really doesn't like to admit, but when he does, he says, they will be automatically brought into Russian culture because Russian culture is organic, it's fraternal, and so there can't be national problems in Russia. It's logically impossible for there to be national minorities, a term he always puts in quotation marks. It's logically impossible for there to be Ukrainians, a term he also puts in quotation marks, because if you're in a Russian empire, a Russian state, you're automatically brought into this organic unity. Okay. And then finally, Russia is a country, and this is where things get really beautiful. I mean, they do in a way get beautiful. Russia is about love. Okay? Russia's about love. Russia's about love. It's about, when he's writing philosophically, the term that he uses is spirit, duch. So in Russia, so in the West, people don't have, you've heard all this before, people don't really have a spirit, they only have an idea of an individual good, but in Russia there's a national spirit which allows people to interpenetrate and to see to see good collectively. When he's writing religiously, he talks about heart. Russians have heart. Europeans do not have heart. Here, I'm not actually simplifying very much. It's a pretty drastic conflation. He says that there's no distinction between religion and national identity. He says in a striking sentence among many. He says, "The nation is not God, comma, but it draws its strength from God." So he denies there's any tension whatsoever between Christianity and Russia. Where does this lead politically? Here he's very explicit. Again, when he's in the religious mode, he says this a couple of times, my prayer is a sword and my sword is a prayer, right? In other words, religion, this business of love, right, heart, spirit, carves out a certain territory, it marks a territory on a map, and that is the territory of love, right? The rest of the world's a territory of anarchy and evil. And when he defines this in a less religious modus, he sounds very much like Carl Schmitt. He says the definition of politics is the definition and neutralization of the enemy. That's what politics is, right? So in Russia, you have one zone, and the rest of the world, you have another zone, which is inherently hostile to Russia. Now, the example, Exhibit A, of how the world is hostile to Russia, in all of his writing is Bolshevism, which he does not, he does say Russians should take responsibility for it, but he thinks fundamentally Bolshevism as a result of foreigners and non-Russians. It's the reason, it's like the latest example of how the West is always against Russia. Okay. What does this recommend? And now you'll begin to feel the contemporary resonances if you read about Russia, or if you know Russia, or if you're from Russia. What does this recommend for domestic politics? Ilyín says there should be a leader, right, a capital L type leader. He sometimes calls him a national dictator. There is no mechanism for how this person will be chosen or for how this person will be succeeded, right? This is the old leader principle from fascism, which says the problem that basically you need Aphrodite coming out of, Zeus's skull. The person has to appear on the scene, as Ilyín explicitly says, not from history. The person has to be unhistorical, right? And when he strains to characterize this, he writes things like, this person will be the living organ of Russia, the instrument for self-redemption. And who is this person? The Russian patriot who leads Russia to salvation, right? So these are the criteria of who this person is going to be. This leader, and Ilyín elucidates this in a long book about a future Russian constitutional structure, should be the head of the army, the only executive, the only legislator, the head of the courts, right? So everything is going to be concentrated in this one person. His correction has a couple of corrections to pre-war fascism. One of them is that he doesn't think there should be a one-party state. He thinks there should be a zero-party state, right? There shouldn't be any parties at all. He very much doesn't like political parties. He thinks political parties can only be vessels for foreign influence. He thinks that civil society as such is negative, right? Civil society can only exist in its contact with foreign bodies, and that is inherently harmful for Russia. And he retains his hostility to the middle classes. The middle classes should be at the very bottom of the pyramid. He defines a kind of corporatist structure in which the head of state, this leader, is at the very top, and then you go down, and at the very bottom you have the middle classes. They can exist, but they should not be allowed to have any political influence whatsoever, right? So the way the middle class has been treated since 2011, the way civil society has been treated since 2011, and the ritual character of democracy. So I almost forgot. Ilyín says there should be elections, but there shouldn't be parties, or if the parties are there, they should only be there for ritual decorative purposes. The election should be public, right? So you should be in public saying who you're going to vote for, and then you should record your vote on a piece of paper which you sign, right? So the purpose of the elections is just to ritualize support for the leader. What does this imply for foreign policy? And now we're getting even closer to the present. What Ilyín does in all of this work, which I hope you find inherently interesting, because I certainly do, but even if you don't, what does this mean for the present? Well, it helps us understand what Eurasia is. The word Eurasia, whenever it's pronounced, I think it's one of these words which leads to an awful lot of confusion. Ilyín helps us to see what Eurasia fundamentally is. Eurasia is fundamentally the dialectical resolution of the old tension in Russian thought between the Westernizers and the Slavophiles. right? What is a Russian westernizer? And I say this with hesitation because like there are Russian historians in the crowd, and they'll scrub my ears later. But a westernizer is someone who believes that Russia is fundamentally on the same historical path as the West, but just a couple steps behind. So politically, these people are usually liberals or socialists. There's progress. There's only one route to progress. Just some people are further along. A Slavophile is a pluralist. A Slavophile says there may not be progress. There may not be routes to progress. There are essentially different cultures in the world or civilizations. Russia is one of those cultures. Politically, that can make you a conservative. It can also make you a certain kind of revolutionary because you can think, well, our culture has the source of a utopia inside it, but it's different from a westernizer, right? What is a Eurasianist? A Eurasianist is a person in the 1920s and 1930s, and Ilyín is the main one who resolves this tension. What a Eurasianist says is, the West is not actually about progress and enlightenment and liberalism and parliamentarism and democracy. That is all an artificial incrustation, right? The suggestion, or sometimes just the bald claim, is that it's a Jewish artifice, right? But the West is not actually inherently, organically associated with progress, liberalism, enlightenment, and so on. Those things can be stripped away from the West and should be stripped away from the West. And the people who've shown how that can be done are the fascists, right? So if the West returns to itself and becomes a kind of commonwealth, right, a kind of plural commonwealth of different fascist or maybe just national populist states, then Russia has a place in Europe, right? Then there is no tension between Russia and everyone else because Russia and everyone else are basically the same, right? So Ilyín is not a Slavophile. He doesn't think that Russia is separate from Europe, right? But he's also not a westernizer because he's not a liberal. He's a Eurasianist who says that we're all basically, let's admit it, we're all basically fascists, right? And if we will all just admit that, then there is no need for there to be this artificial division between East and West. Now, he solves this problem intellectually. He also solves it in his person, right? Ilyín is basically a German philosopher who writes in Russian, right? He writes his dissertation about Hegel. His most important influence was Husserl. He gives most of his speeches in German. He writes in German as much as he writes in Russian. All of his major ideas are in some way in German rather than Russian debates. His mother was German. His mother tongue was German. You know, when he does psychotherapy, what language is he doing psychotherapy in with Freud as a very young man? In German, of course, right? He's very intimately a German. In 1915, when he's struggling with the war and the fact that he's not fighting in it, he says, the inner Germans are bothering me more than the outer Germans, right? The inner Germans, a very nice phrase. So, and then he lives his whole life, his whole adult life, well, from the age of 39 forward, he lives most of his adult life in German-speaking countries, right? And he is comfortable with a certain kind of Europe. It's not that he's not, he just thinks that Europe has to be nudged along to look slightly differently. Okay, so that's Eurasianism. How does that relate to the Eurasianism of today? And here's where we have to make the one jump, or where I think the Russian thinkers of today, including the head of state, have made a certain jump. So Ilyín dies in 1954. He's writing right up until then. And when he's talking about fascism, right, he's talking about what's normal not just for Russia, but for Europe. And he thinks that when he looks around in Europe, I mean, maybe 1954 is about as late as you can possibly think this. He looks around Europe and he says, fascism is normal, right? And what are his examples? Spain and Portugal, right? Franco and Salazar, right? This is the way that Europe is going to be. This is the way Russia is going to be. This is normal. Now, historically, you know, we know the problem with that, right? So I can't avoid a little retrospection here. We know what's going to happen. We know Spain and Portugal are going to lose their empires. They're going to lose their authoritarian regimes. They're going to become democracies. They're going to join this thing called the European Economic Community. They're going to join this thing called the European Union. They're going to have a kind of history, and they're going to join a kind of body which Ilyín could not have foreseen, namely Europe. So how do you then interpret Ilín's thought in a world where there's a European Union? What the modern Eurasianists do is that they say Europe is the source of problems. The European Union is the source of problems. The European Union is decadent, right? Now you see all the language from 2012, 2013, which comes straight from Ilyín and from the 1920s and 1930s. The European Union becomes the source of all of these negative, artificial, you know, very often sexual ideas which are seeking to penetrate and to transform Russia. So the move that's made is to replace the European Union with Bolshevism. So there is no Bolshevism, but now everything which you have is the European Union. Okay, let me bring this to a conclusion. If this is true, right, What does this do? Well, it solves problems. I mean, ideologies work because they solve problems. It solves the problem of 2011. It's not, I think, a coincidence that when Putin, in addition to blaming it all on Hillary Clinton, right, Putin, when he's announcing his triumph, he cites Iván Ilyín in December of 2011, which is the crucial moment of the suppression of Russian democracy. And what is the consequence of all of this? The consequence is that they not only begin to build a system which looks very Ilyín-like after 2011, but also they succeed in exporting the problems. And the crucial problem that they export is corruption. Okay? Because what is corruption? I mean, if you're thinking about the rule of law, Russia's a very corrupt state. I mean, it's down there with Ukraine and pretty much as low as you want to go. Sierra Leone, Bangladesh, that's the neighborhood. But if corruption is moral corruption, you can always say there are more gay people in the West, then it's all about sexuality, right? So there's a subtle, maybe not so subtle, there's an important change in the definition of what corruption is, so that corruption becomes a problem in the West rather than a problem in Russia. Then, of course, you see the source of the idea of Eurasia, and you also see the source of the blunders that Russia makes in Ukraine, right? You can really only understand Russia's policy in Ukraine, which was a whole series of miscalculations and blunders, if you accept, as Ilyín accepts, as Putin accepts, that there really isn't a Ukrainian people, right? Because so many of the things that happen, right, inside Ukraine, only like the protests, even like the war, which was largely an NGO effort, only makes sense if you accept that there's a Ukrainian society which does things without some kind of external stimulus, right? Which does in fact happen to be the case. And it's only if you think that just intervening in Ukraine is going to bring the whole state down because there really isn't a Ukraine that the policy itself can seem to make a kind of sense. Of course, when you blunder into a war, you never ever say I blundered into a war. You always blame someone else. And Ilyín is very convincing and very useful here. At the end, right, when they annex Crimea, Putin gives a speech a few months later in which he says Crimea is Russia's Jerusalem, make of that what you will, and as the authority cites precisely Ilyín. But the point about Crimea is that that's the moment when they start saying that it's all about the Americans, right? That the Americans made us do this. We didn't have any choice. We had to do this because of the Americans, which is Ilyín. Maybe they get it somewhere else, but this idea that Russia is innocent no matter what it does, of which there are more spectacular examples, right? Like shooting down the Malaysian aircraft, right? When they shot down the Malaysian aircraft, which they did, they say, well, this was actually an assassination attempt on Putin, right? Which transforms like the real victims into Russia being the national victim, like immediately. And when I say immediately, I mean literally immediately. 3.5 hours after the event, it was already being reported on Russian television as an assassination attempt on the Russian head of state, right? We are innocent. No matter what we are doing, we are innocent, and it's the West's fault. Okay. Now, this also helps to explain, I think, something which is really important, which is the basic logic of Russian policy towards Ukraine. Russian policy towards Ukraine from the beginning has always been about Europe, and it has been openly characterized as being about Europe. The claim was that the Europeans were behind the Maidan, right? The claim that was made from Russia to Ukraine was that the Europeans are forcing their Western ideas upon you. When Russia tried to peel Ukrainians away from the protests, what they talked about was how things like, if you wanted free travel in the European Union, you had to first accept gay marriage, right? Things like this, right? This was the kind of propaganda they offered. And since then, I mean, literally since then, Russia has unfolded a policy against the European Union, I think of which Ukraine is only one part. When you invade Ukraine and you annex some of its territory, you're violating the fundamental norm of international law, right? That's fundamental, it shouldn't be forgotten. But in addition to that, we've had all kinds of other interesting things, like funding separatists and national populists inside the European Union, most prominently the Front National, like using media resources, especially RT, the big Russian television network, to support separatism and national populism inside European Union states. Like deliberately bombing the Syrians into Germany after Merkel made it clear that they would be accepted, and then manufacturing rape scandals involving Muslims inside Germany, which I think is particularly nasty, although not exceptional. This is all part, I think, of a general policy of treating the European Union as the fundamental foe, right, of Russian policy, which I think it is, and which is hard to explain without some kind of ideological framework. Now, in closing, I've tried in this very brief period to be fair to Ilyín. And I want to ask a question which is not historical, right? Because if I'm right and Ilyín has influenced Russia, that's, people take what they need from ideas. It doesn't have to be coherent or true or faithful. But let me just ask by way of a closing gesture, is the Russian elite actually being fair to Ilyín? Are they interpreting him in a way which is actually fair to his ideas? Because when you make the move of saying, it's not really Bolshevism that was the problem, it's the European Union that's the problem, you're actually doing something very fundamental, right? Because what Ilyín thought was that Bolshevism, although it came from the outside, had become a problem for Russia. And that Russia had to begin, when Russia was free, Russia had to begin with a self-investigation, right? Russia had to have a thoroughgoing decommunization, right? Russia had to have honest publication of historical documents and an honest discussion of the crimes of Bolshevism, on which he wrote bountifully, right? So all of the crimes which are now put in question by Russian memory policy, if there's a crime, it means that Ilyín wrote a whole book on it. And he was actually quite good, including on the famine in Ukraine, right? Ilyín wrote about all of these things and bountifully. And Ilyín also thought that the regeneration couldn't just involve blaming all of Russia's problems on other people. That it had to begin with Russia, and he proposed in his constitutional sketches decommunization, which involved a selection of who could and who couldn't take part in the new Russian state. Right. So, for example, KGB officers were not to be allowed to participate in the Russian state, which would mean that if Putin were going to take Ilyín literally, he would have to, rather than doing dramatic things like reburying him in the flowers and so on, he would have to resign from office. Now, I raise this as not just an ironic point, but partly as a serious point, because it comes down to the question of what this is all about in the end. From Ilyín's point of view, there had to be a renewal of Russia. There had to be a fascist period, but he saw it as a kind of purge, after which Russia would become some kind of right-wing rule of law state. What is happening now in Russia is not, to put it very briefly, is not that. There's no sense in which this is some kind of transitory period towards something else. What you see is what you get, right? And there's no sense in which, I think it's fair to say, there's no sense in which the Russian leaders are following Ilyn's basic guideline, which is that you have to be true and critical of yourself and not just of others. And I think that leads us to a point where the fundamental influence of Ilyn's geopolitical fascism is a kind of permanent war of disintegration on others, which has no endpoint, right? Which is really just about spreading anarchy, where there really isn't anything else. There's no final goal. That's just it for as long as it lasts. And this isn't a way of solving the problem of succession, but it's a very good way of distracting attention from it. And it's working for that for the time being. Okay, thanks.